When we last left off, our main character, Nick, had just invented his new word, Frindle, meaning the same thing as pen. He'd gotten a bunch of his classmates to start using it. They convinced the lady at the store, the penny pantry, that that's what it meant. And Miss Granger even started having a rule that you'd have to stay in after school for detention and write 100 times that this punishment is written with a pen. Despite all that, kids are still using the word, and it's mighty popular. Nick even had a special meeting with Mrs. Granger to see if he would stop. And in the meeting, they didn't come to a truce, but Nick signed a letter that he was going to receive when all of this is over. Chapter 9. Chess. Miss Margaret Chatham had been principal of Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School was torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Miss Chatham had asked Nick to be there too. It was 6:30 when she knocked, and Nick opened the door. "Good evening, Nick," she said. No smile. "Hi, Miss Chatham," said Nick, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would play linebacker on a football team because that's what his dad had played in college. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen," she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a long black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it into her left pocket. She shook hands stiffly with both Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Here is a picture of Nick's parents meeting the principal. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat on the rocking chair that faced Miss Chatham, sit across the low coffee table. "This is not easy visit for me. We are having some trouble at school, and it appears that Nick is in the middle of it." Then, while Nick's parents listened, Miss Chatham laid out the story as she saw it, Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined 5th grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and the general feeling that there was rebellion at school, with no one respecting the rules anymore. Nick watched his mom and dad while Miss Chatham talked, looking from one face to another. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Miss Chatham finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. "But doesn't this all seem like a lot of fuss about something pretty silly?" Nick sat quietly, but his mom shouted, "Hurrah for Mom! Hurrah for mothers everywhere!" Nick's pretty excited that his mom's not mad at him. He's kind of mad at the school. His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, and maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chatham. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allen was still talking to the principal. "I mean, is there really any harm in children making up a funny word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used?" Miss Chatham sighed and said, "Yes, I suppose it does seem silly, but Mrs. Granger thinks that it's rather like keeping children from saying ain't. There have to be standards. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself, but the lack of respect for authority. Mr. Allen says, Mrs. Granger is right about that. There has to be standards. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we? And that's when Nick piped in. You know the big dictionary in Miss Granger's classroom? The word ain't is right there in the book. I looked it up, and there it was. I don't see why I can't use a word if it's in the dictionary. Miss Granger even said that her big dictionary was the law. There he goes again, twisting Mrs. Granger's words to make what he wants the reality. Nick looked from face to face to face. That stumped them all. He had just launched his first-class thought grenade. So right there, that's a metaphor. They're comparing his thoughts to a grenade, the way they blow people's minds, as you might say. Which is an idiom, blowing someone's mind. You're not actually blowing it up. It's like having a crazy, amazing thought, like unlocking something. Well, yes, but, well, as I said, the word ain't and even the word frindle, these aren't the real issues here, said Mrs. Chatham. Mrs. Allen said, well, I think the real issue is Miss Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. It's an overreaction. Don't you think so, Tom? And Mrs. Allen looked at her husband. Well, that's kind of putting him on the spot between the principal and the wife. I don't know. It was Mr. Allen's turn to look from face to face to face. He was lost. Yes, well, sure. I guess so. I mean, it's not like anybody's been hurt. I mean, it's not like vandalism or stealing or something like that. His sentence trailed off, and he rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully. So right there, the author didn't directly say he was nervous or uncomfortable or felt like he was stuck in a spot, but the way that they wrote it out with the pauses, with the dots and the stammering, really kind of shows how he feels through language. He stared thoughtfully through the window on the wall behind Miss Chatham. And while the three grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what was really going on here. It was like a chess game. Nick against Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger had tried to end the game by using her queen, Miss Chatham, in her black raincoat, the Black Queen. So they're comparing Miss Chatham, the principal, to a chess piece. So it's kind of like a big metaphor we're getting into. Nick didn't know until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own. Good old Mom, the White Queen, because there's black and white pieces on the chessboard. And the game was not over. It would go on until there was a winner and a loser. Miss Chatham didn't stay much longer. There was a little more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how children have the right to explore new ideas, about the importance of respecting teachers and the work they do, about everybody needing to keep up standards and make school a safe place to learn. Then Mr. Allen offered Mrs. Chastain some coffee and banana bread, but she said, "No thanks, I really must be going now." She thanked Nick's parents, and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, "Good night, Miss Chatham." Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. "Nick, I think we'd better talk a little more about this," said his mom, sitting back down on the couch. "If I find out that you've been disrespectful to Mrs. Granger and any other teacher at school, then you really will be in big trouble." So right there, you saw Nick's mom was on his side when the principal was there, but then was a little bit harder on him once she left. "I haven't been disrespectful. Honest. did get everybody to start using my word, but like you said, it's not hurting anybody. And I'm sorry if me and Dave and Pete got everybody to ask Mrs. Granger to borrow a Frindle. That was mean, I guess. But she started it by making kids stay after school and write 100 sentences just for saying my word once. All the kids like to use my word. It's just fun, that's all. Well, said Nick's dad, if it gets everyone upset and makes the principal come talk to your mother and me, then it must not be fun for everybody, is it? And I think you should just tell all your friends to knock it off right now. I mean, tomorrow. Nick shook his head. I can't, Dad. It won't work. It's a real word now. It used to just be mine, but not anymore. If I knew how to stop it, I think I probably would, but I can't. And Nick looked at both of their faces to see if the idea was sinking in. It was. Like I said, I won't be disrespectful, but I do like my word. And I guess now we're just going to have to see what happens. And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, which is a metaphor for his parents, had to agree. The game would go on. Chapter 10. Freedom of the Press. Judy Morgan was a reporter for the Westfield Gazette, the local newspaper. Westfield was a quiet little town. There was the occasional burglary. The teenagers got rowdy once in a while, and there was some shouting at the town council or the planning board now and then. But mostly, things were calm and orderly in Westfield. And every Thursday, the Westfield Gazette proved it. Ted Bell sold advertisements for the paper, and he had a daughter in 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. He told Judy that a bunch of 5th graders were making trouble and were not obeying teachers anymore, that there was something about a secret code word that they were all using. It's always funny how parents seem to not quite get it right sometimes. And half the students had been kept after school one day last week, including his own little girl. The only other story Judy was working on was about 18 new trees that were going to be planted along East Main Street. The trees could wait. This thing at the elementary school sounded like a real story. So Judy Morgan showed up at Lincoln Elementary School at 3 o'clock the day after Miss Chapman had been to visit Nick's parents. The sign on the door said all visitors must report to the office, and she did. On the bulletin board outside the office, Judy saw Mrs. Granger's notice about the punishment for using the word Frindle. She stepped back 2 paces, aimed her camera at the notice, and snapped a photo. She read the notice once more, and then stepped into the office. Mrs. Freed, the school secretary, looked up and smiled. "May I help you?" "Yes, I'm sure you can. My name is Judy Morgan. I work for the Westfield Gazette. I'd like to know about the poster outside the office, the one with this word Frindle. Who should I talk to?" Mrs. Freed stopped smiling. She was sick and tired of anything to do with that word. For the past week, her phone had been ringing off the hook. So that's probably a bit of a hyperbole there. It probably hasn't been ringing quite that much. If it wasn't a parent complaining about a child who had to stay after school, it was someone from the school board trying to get in touch with Miss Chapman or Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Freed pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. Once again, it's a way of showing that people are upset without actually just saying upset. They kind of visualize their face. Mrs. Freed pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. She said, "You'll have to speak with the principal. Let me see if Miss Chapman is free." She was. There isn't a principal alive who wouldn't find time to talk to someone from the local newspaper. The reporter was invited into Mrs. Chathman's office. Judy noticed right away that the principal was not comfortable talking about this stuff. When asked about the poster outside the office, Miss Chathman laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's really nothing. Some kids have been playing a prank, and it was time to put that to a stop to it." The principal laughed and sounded phony to Judy Morgan. "And did that notice really put an end to the prank? I hear that a lot of children were kept after school last week. Would you tell me a little about that? Parents would like to know what's going on." Miss Chathman looked like a kid who had been sent to the principal's office. Right there was a little simile between Miss Chathman and the principal being compared to a kid sent to the principal. This is a bit different than when she was talking to Nick's parents. She kind of lost her confidence there. A little bit more uncertain. She squirmed a little in her chair and tried to smile. She said, "Well, we do have a little problem, but it's under control. Mrs. Granger may have overreacted a bit." She's not even backing up Mrs. Granger as much as she was. "I don't think the children have really been trying to be disrespectful. They're just having some fun, and it's more like a difference of opinion." And then Miss Chathman went on to tell the reporter what she knew about the word Frindle and how it had become popular among the students. Judy Morgan took careful notes, and when the principal had finished, Judy said, "Would you mind if I asked Miss Granger a few questions?" Miss Chathman said, "No, not at all." But Judy could tell that the principal wished she would just go away. What could she say, though? Miss Chathman couldn't very well keep the reporter away from Mrs. Granger because, after all, America is a free country with free press. If Judy really wanted to, she could talk to Mrs. Granger sooner or later. It was sooner. 3 minutes, Judy Morgan was standing at the doorway of room 12, looking at Mrs. Granger. There was about 15 children sitting at desks scattered around the room, busy writing out their 100 sentences. She knocked, and then the teacher and the students looked up from their work. "I'm Judy Morgan from the Westfield Gazette, Mrs. Granger. May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Granger stood and came out into the hallway and closed the door. Judy could see past her and saw that every kid in the room was straining to listen. They're eavesdropping on them. Very curious kids. Judy noticed Mrs. Granger's eyes right away, gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp. But not hard or mean, just bright and strong. The reporter didn't waste words. "So I hear that you plan to stop the students from using their new word. How goes the battle?" Mrs. Granger did not smile, and her eyes got even brighter. "First of all, it's not a battle. I am merely helping my students see that this foolishness should stop. Such a waste of time and thought. There is no reason to invent a new word and useless words. They should each learn to use the words we already have. But of course, all this is just a silly fad, and when you add an E to fad, you get fade. And I predict this fad will fade." Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, "Any idea how it all got started?" Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch on fire at that question, and she said, "Yes, I have a very good idea how it all got started. It was one young man's idea, a 5th grade student named Nicholas Allen. And now you will have to excuse me, Mrs. Morgan, for I have papers I must grade," and with a brief, firm handshake, Mrs. Granger ended the interview. So this book is a little bit fictitious in the fact that teachers aren't really allowed to call out students to the newspaper like that, but we won't judge it too much. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on a bench outside the office so she could look over her notes to make sure they made sense. It took her about 5 minutes. Then Judy stood up and put her notebook in a large black purse and waved goodbye to a frowning Miss Freed and headed out the door. As she walked to the parking lot, 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out another door. Judy walked beside them, listening to them laugh and joke. Then she asked them, "Why do you kids keep saying Frindle? Don't you hate saying after school?" A boy was almost falling over from the weight of his backpack. Looked up at her and smiled. "It's not so bad. There's always a bunch of my friends there. I've written that sentence 600 times now." And then the kids said Mrs. Granger didn't even look at their punishment papers anymore. They were sure because you were supposed to write, "I am writing this punishment with a pen." Everyone was writing the word Frindle every 4th or 5th sentence. And Mrs. Granger hadn't said anything. One girl bragged that she had written the word Frindle 45 times on her sheet today. She grinned and said, "That's a new record." "And this boy named Nick," Judy asked, "has he had to stay after school too?" The kids giggled, and a tall boy with reddish-brown hair and glasses said, "Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks that she wants to adopt him." The reporter smiled and said, "Do you think I could find Nick and talk to him after this afternoon?" The boy looked at Judy for a second. I wonder who this boy is. And then said, "I don't think Nick would want to talk to you right now. He might say something stupid and get himself in trouble." Then he grinned at his friends. The kids laughed and poked and punched each other and headed off down the block. Judy drove back to her office and started writing. Here is a picture of the writing sentences. You might notice in this picture, every single word says, "I am writing this punishment with a Frindle." The next morning, a brown envelope arrived at the Gazette offices addressed to Judy Morgan. Below her name was written, "Frindle Story." When Judy opened it, there was a class picture. The 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary. Mrs. Granger and the 6 other teachers were standing at the ends of the rows, and the kids were dressed neatly, hair all combed. But there was something odd about the picture. The reporter looked closely and saw that each kid was holding up a pen. And each little mouth was puckered in the same way. And puckered is like a weird shape. Oftentimes it's like a sort of shape. She was puzzled for a second, but then she said softly, "Of course, they're all saying Frindle." Written on the back of the picture in neat cursive was 3rd row, 5th from the left. Judy looked at the picture, and there she saw the same grinning red-haired boy with glasses she had talked to in the school parking lot yesterday. She just had a discovery. The boy she was talking to, that was Nick. She chuckled and said, "Well, well, well. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Nicholas Allen." So, that is where we'll end today. I would like you to go to the description box below, click the link and take the quiz, and make a prediction of what might happen next time.